All right. Well, yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. We're really excited to have you today. My name is Will Stevens. I'm one of the co-founders of Beer Menus, and I'm also a certified Cicerone. And I'm really excited to have here Pat Fahey, who is going to be discussing curating balanced draft lists. Pat works at the Cicerone program managing exam content as well as education and training materials. He's also one of 11 master cicerones in the world and regularly judges the Great American Brew Fest, which, as you may know, is one of the most well-respected competitions in the country. Needless to say, we're really lucky to have him here, and we're excited to jump into it. As you guys probably know, managing beer lists or getting into preparing for the Cicerone exam, curating draft lists is becoming increasingly challenging as all these new breweries are opening up and there's so many options out there for beers to pick. So we're really excited to jump into it. If you have any questions along the way, you can post comments on the YouTube page, and we're going to be tracking that the whole time, and we'll make sure to get to all of your questions. So without any further ado, here is Pat from the Cicerone program.
Awesome. Thanks, Will. We transferred over to me now?
Yep.
Groovy. So like Will said, my name's Pat Fahey. I'm the content manager for Cicerone. And so as we're going here, if you guys have questions that come up, like he said, throw them in the YouTube comment section. Going to be happy to hit on those after we get through sort of the first little section here. I'm going to be talking today a little bit about my thoughts on building a balanced or building a, let's just say building an awesome beer list for a bar. What we're going to discuss here is not necessarily data driven. It's not like based on if you put on this combination of beers, you're going to sell X number of kegs more. This more comes from a looking at the consumer experience and trying to build a positive experience for your consumers by having the best draft list that appeals to the broadest segment of consumers possible. So when I talk about what I think is best in building a draft list, one of the biggest factors that I look at is building a balanced list, because in building a list that is balanced, you make sure that you are targeting as many different consumers or as many different groups of beer lovers or beer drinkers as possible. And one of the first questions that people often ask is, well, in order to build a balanced list, do I need to have like 50 taps or 100 taps? And, when you talk about ideal number of taps for a bar, there's no true correct answer. There's a lot of different theories or different sort of ways that people can take that. One of the things that our founder, Ray Daniels, likes to say, Ray has sort of his Tuesday tap number rule, and that's that you shouldn't have more draft lines than the number of customers you have in your bar at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday. It's a little bit kitschy, but I think it illustrates a good point that having more draft lines isn't always a better thing. There are definitely programs that build draft lists where they have an enormous number of lines and are able to manage that sort of program. But it's good to recognize that that's not necessarily the best thing for everyone, that you don't necessarily have to have a huge number of taps in order to have a solid quality draft program. Some of the things that happen as you expand in lines, it becomes more inventory to manage. It becomes more beer that you have to dump every time you do a line cleaning. It becomes a sort of like a greater burden on your staff to have knowledge and be able to talk about all of those things. So those are the things that you want to consider if you are in a stage where you're either deciding how many draft lines you want to have, if you're building a bar, or if you are already a bar and you're looking to potentially expand the number of lines. There are definitely good reasons to do that, but make sure that if you do that, you're doing it for the right reason. So when I talk, like for the rest of what I'm talking about, I'm pretty much going to focus on what I see as the areas you want to look at when you're looking to build a balanced list. And I sort of give that little upfront thing because you can build a balanced list with 8 lines. You can build a balanced list with 20 lines, and you can build a balanced list with 100 lines. It's important that whatever size you're at, you are sort of keeping some or as many of these things as possible in mind so that you're working with the best list possible. So when I talk about balance, I'm generally referring to several different traits of beer. We'll cover each one individually, but when you're thinking about each one of these traits, you want to try to hit a wide range of beers. And for each one of these, I'll illustrate what it looks like when you don't have a wide range of those things present. The first topic that I usually like to hit on is ABV, or alcohol content of beers. And this is a big personal pet peeve of mine. If you go and you look at the lists of the most popular or most sought after beers on like Beer Advocate or Rate Beer, the vast majority of them are going to be things like double IPAs and imperial stouts. A lot of those are going to be beers that fall at like 8, 9, 10% alcohol and higher. Those aren't necessarily beers that you can sit around and just drink a bunch of. And I know that a lot of people, myself included, sometimes when they're going out to the bar, it's not necessarily to drink the hottest, newest, most exciting thing. It can be to just go and have a couple of pints. So when you're building a list, is it okay to have really high alcohol behemoth beers on your list? Absolutely. But I remember being at a bar down in Dallas that had a list of a number of different beers that would potentially make some of those Beer Advocate lists. Very sought after beers, very cool looking list. There were, I think, about 30 taps and 2 beers that were under 7% alcohol. So when you are designing your list, remember to design for sort of all ends of the alcohol spectrum, so that if you have people going in and they want to have a 4.5% or even like a 5.5% alcohol beer, that they have a couple options that they can choose from. The second thing that I like to hit on, and I think that this is something that a lot of people look at when they're building draft programs. I know some of the better and more exciting draft programs that I've seen before really sort of focus in and have their own way of making sure that they accomplish this, but is balancing beer styles, or more generally beer flavor groups. So when you look at putting together a draft list, it's good to try to hit on different portions of the spectrum of different beer profiles that you can potentially see. The flip side of not doing this is when you go into a bar that has 10 lines and 6 of them are American IPAs. American IPA is very popular. If you had to pick like one style to more heavily weight than other styles, American IPA would probably be your choice. But building a list that slants too heavily in that direction is going to alienate some drinkers. So when I look at a list, or when I like generally think about how I categorize within a list, I think of things that are like hop forward, things that are generally malt forward, things that maybe are driven by yeast character. I look at beers that maybe have a roast component to them, or beers that have some amount of acidity or any wild yeast character to them. So there are a number of different groups that you can sort of break your list out into. And in general, once again, to appeal to as many people as possible, I think it's best to try and hit a couple beers in each group. I remember I was doing a talk sort of on similar material at the Nightclub and Bar Show a few months ago. And I had somebody ask, well, like, if I've already got a stout on, should I be making sure that I have a porter on too, so that I make sure that that style is represented? And that's not necessarily what I'm saying. You don't have to have like every style represented, but in general, it's nice, at least if you're looking for a starting point, to try to hit at least something from each of these groups. So I would lump both porter and stout into sort of a similar roast driven flavor profile, that might be one category that you would want to hit on. The other thing, and sort of the ultimate thing here, is don't feel like you have to cover every flavor profile. If you put a roasty beer on because you're like, I really want to hit that segment, and you have like one keg of some stout on and it's been on for 4 weeks and it's just not moving, don't be like, oh, Pat said you should try to hit balanced areas of the flavor spectrum, so I got to have this on there. If the ultimate thing on any of these is pay attention to what your clientele is drinking and what they like, and let that guide some of your decisions. One of the other things before I move off of that style note is a lot of the people that I talk to, at least, and I don't necessarily know who all of the audience is out there, but a lot of people that I talk to are attempting to assemble a list focused on craft beer drinkers. Important to remember when you're building a program, especially if you're the kind of place where like, we're only going to do craft beer, or we're only going to do local and independent beer, or we're only going to do any of those things. Have something on for your drinkers that primarily like to drink American lagers or that style of beer. I mean, I know people that will say, well, we don't really want to cater them by putting American lager on. That's fine, but you're still going to get those people in your bar, or maybe they'll come in with, you'll have a family where some of the people are really into craft and some of them have really only drank American lager for most of their beer drinking life. You want to have something that's going to satisfy those people. So put something like a Kolschan or an American wheat beer or some sort of blonde ale, something that is very approachable. Once again, with this idea of trying to target as big of a segment of the populace as possible. In that same vein, I mentioned sort of the idea of doing all local beer, perhaps. For some bars, that's sort of their thing. They say, we're going to be a place that just features local beer, and that's fine too. For most establishments, if that's not sort of your concept, it's good to feature a balance of local and regional craft, and then also maybe even factoring in some imported craft or craft styles of beer, because once again, you're trying to target a broad swath of people. So with your larger regional brands, like your Sierra Nevadas, your New Belgiums, those are brands that, I mean, they make awesome beer, but the other thing to that end is when you have a drinker that comes in that's maybe not as adventurous and wants to drink something that they're familiar with, having something like that where it's a name that they've heard before or a beer that they've maybe even tried before is something that can at least help them get started or make them feel more comfortable. On the flip side, you definitely get drinkers who are like, I want to try the newest thing, or I want to try something that's hyper local. And so for them, it's good to also balance on the other side of the spectrum and have some of those beers that are really going to be unique to your area or your neighborhood or your city, or whatever scale you're trying to work on. But once again, it's just sort of this idea of trying to come at it from a perspective of creating balance so that you get as many people enthused as possible. The last note that I have here on sort of a balance thing, and it's not necessarily a balance issue in terms of you want to make sure you do like half and half or something, but something that you can consider in augmenting or changing up your draft program is nitro beer. We see a lot of breweries, or more and more breweries today, putting out kegs of beer on nitro. And it's not usually the sort of thing that you're going to have more than 1 or 2 lines of. I guess it depends on the size of your bar. If you have 150 lines, maybe you'd have 10 nitro lines on. But nitro beer is sort of another interesting option that you can work with when you're serving beer. It's something that a lot of people find exciting. And so having 1 or 2 nitro lines on gives you another opportunity to sort of play with different styles of beer and different ways of serving beer. And that's something that can be exciting to people. So that's the majority of what I have prepared. I know I wanted to make sure that I left some time for questions, but the sort of the take-home message, or the one thing that I want to make sure everybody walks away with here, is I just covered several different things that you can consider when putting together a balanced list. Remember that you don't have to be like trying to work really hard to make sure that you hit all of these, and that some of these may be more important than others. I think balanced ABV list and balanced sort of styles and flavor profiles are really sort of the two most important things to pay attention to. But lastly, keep in mind that your clientele is the ultimate vote. Like, listen to your patrons, listen to what they're saying, or if they ask your bartenders to say, hey, I really wish that you guys had this beer on or this style on. And then also just pay attention to what's selling and use that to sort of fine tune your list, because that's ultimately going to be the best way to put together a successful program.
Yeah, absolutely. So just looking at the questions that have come in so far, someone asked if this will be available to watch later, and it will be available to watch later. We'll send you an email about that. One thing that I thought would be good to touch on is just how to factor in rotation, or how often you might want to change the beers that you have. Did you have any thoughts on that, Pat?
How often to factor in rotation? So once again, this is sort of like a gauging your clientele sort of thing. If you are primarily dealing with people that are like, we always want the newest thing and we want what's local, if you're working with primarily that group, maybe you want to be doing a lot of rotation. I mean, you see a lot of bars today that are just like constantly turning over handles. My opinion is, once again, with the idea of playing to a wide group of consumers, you're going to have people come in who potentially, when they sit down with a list of 20 beers that they've never heard of, find that disconcerting or find that difficult to make a decision, and maybe end up ordering something other than beer because of it. So I think it is a good idea to not be entirely rotating in your lineup, to maybe have some beers that are mainstays within your draft lineup, so that for people who are regulars or people who are maybe not as comfortable trying new things, they know that they can go there and there'll be at least a few things that they recognize on. The question gets a lot more complicated when you start to, depending upon who you talk to, because I know like constantly rotating can be a headache for bars from a managing inventory perspective. It certainly can be difficult for distributors and breweries when they're also trying to, manage inventory and make plans and all of those sorts of things. And especially if you're in a state where the wholesalers are responsible for cleaning their lines. If you're constantly swapping beers and swapping which distributor is responsible for each line, that can make who is responsible for cleaning the line get a little bit hairy. So those are sort of like the higher level or the more intricate concerns there. At a more general level, I would say some rotation is almost definitely going to happen in most places as you sort of swap things in and out to figure what works and doesn't work at your bar. But I do think it is a good idea to not just be always switching everything.
Definitely. I think a question came in. Are there certain staple beers for certain seasons that you would recommend? Yeah, I'm trying to think. Best way to handle seasonal beers. It seems like they're pretty popular at this point.
That's actually something I had on my list originally as another sort of balance point to check. And it's less accounting for seasonals and more thinking about seasonality of your list overall. So like if you're a bar that is in a location where it gets hot in the summer, and especially if you have any outdoor seating, when you're in the summer months, you maybe want to be thinking about beer styles that are lighter, refreshing, easier to consume in volume. I had a couple on here like things that I like to drink on the patio, and beers that are exciting, like to me in the summer, things like Belgian wit beer or Goza or Saison. These are some styles that can be complex and very interesting, but are still very refreshing. And so are things that I like to drink when it's hot out. As it gets cooler in the year, I think people tend to sort of shift towards drinking beers that are darker in color, or at least they seem less averse to it. I personally think it's ridiculous. You're at like a backyard barbecue in the middle of the summer. Irish Stout is like awesome with most of the things that are there. So I, in no means, am advocating for people to not drink dark beers in the warm months. But I think that in general, you do see people consuming less of those beers when it is hotter out. So if that's something you see among your clientele, consider that as you shift into the cooler months of the year. Maybe you should start moving a couple of your lines towards putting on something that is darker or has more roast or toast character. In general, also, people are more comfortable or are more prone to drinking higher alcohol beers as the temperatures drop. So, it's just something to pay attention to. When you're talking strictly about like seasonals from breweries, that sort of fits in the same category as like rotating taps, because those are going to be things that are going to rotate periodically. But in a lot of cases, if you can count on a brewery 3 months out of the year producing this beer that sells well at your bar, put that on. That's 3 months is like basically that's like a firm handle in this day and age.
Yeah. So one other question came in. What do you think about giving one brewery more than one spot if you have a small draft list? And I think that basically touches on a larger issue of balance with breweries as well as flavor profiles.
Mm-hmm. So to that end, once again, it's kind of what your customer base is looking for. And also sometimes that's going to come down to breweries that you like or breweries that you have relationships with. So, if you find that in particular, this especially is true if it's a brewery that's local to your area, where you might want to feature multiple beers from that brewery. Or let's say that like there's a brewery where you really dig their IPA and you really dig their Pilsner, and you generally want to have at least one IPA line and one Pilsner line on. I don't see a good reason to be like, well, in the interest of making sure that we're equitable and balanced, we need to make sure that we include as many breweries as possible. It's something to think about, and it's something that does appeal to some people. But like, if you've got a brewery and you've got a good relationship with them, and you're really amped on a couple of their beers that cover different flavor profiles, I see no reason why you shouldn't have those be on, or multiple beers from a given brewery. Once again, with all of this balance stuff, I said at the outset, my biggest thing is like ABV. I really don't like going into a bar where like I don't have a lot of options in terms of, in case I want to drink beers that are on the lower end of the ABV spectrum. If you're a bar where your clientele just crushes through beers that are all 10+% alcohol, and you want to do that, then you do that. Like, that's like, if it works, that's fine. This is all just things that you can think about.
Indeed. Question just came in. What do you think about international beers, and which ones might be popular?
Are they asking for me to name specific brands? I'm trying to avoid that as much as possible. I think with the way that American craft has been going, you see a lot of producers in the U.S. making versions of beers that we find imported, and in a lot of cases they're very good. But in some cases, you still see the best examples of a lot of Belgian styles, or a lot of German styles, or a lot of English styles coming from those countries. And so if you are able to get them in fresh and work with your wholesaler to make sure that that's happening, I think that there's definitely some value to be had in incorporating some imports into your lineup. I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of beers that I have great love for that are from like Belgium and Germany and the UK, and you get other versions of those styles produced in the US, but there's something to be said for the originators of those styles. In some cases, they do still do it best.
Another question just came in. How important is it to clean lines when rotating beer often?
Oh boy. So people will ask sometimes, I mean, in general, and I think we're going to do one of these talks specifically on draft maintenance at some point. In general, I say, you know, whenever you have a system, you want to be cleaning lines every 2 weeks. If you're switching between beers more frequently than that, do you have to clean lines every time you switch a beer? In most cases, no. However, if you are taking a beer that is very strongly flavored and putting on another beer that is not quite as intensely flavored, or if you just had a beer on that had like really intense smoke character or chili heat or high level of acidity, those are things that can sometimes get sort of impregnated into draft lines. So with those cases, I know like I've had beers before where I was like, oh, I didn't realize this was smoked barley wine, and they're like, ooh, the last beer that was on there was this like smoked lager, or like I didn't realize they made apple cider Oktoberfest, where you get strong cider flavors carrying over. In general, when you have those very strongly flavored beers, you may want to at least run water through the lines, or give the line an outright cleaning between that and the next beer that you put on. The other thing, and this is just kind of like a tip, if you end up having flavor carryover from one beer to the next, and you've cleaned the lines and you're still getting flavor carryover, the thing to know is that most of the flavor carryover that happens in the first 5 feet of jumper line, that flexible polyvinyl hose that you have in a long draw draft system. And so if you aren't able to get rid of the flavor through cleaning, replacing that section of line is usually going to be enough to get rid of the flavor carryover that you're having from a previous beer, and that'll only run you like $1 or $2. So if you're having really big issues with flavor carryover from one beer to the next, and you've cleaned the lines and it's not getting better, just swap out the jumper line for that line, and you'll save yourself a lot of headache and trouble.
And then one more question just came in. What is the best way to motivate staff or managers to get behind craft beer?
What is the best way to motivate staff or managers to get behind craft beer? What a question. Have them drink it. I mean, one of the things, there are a couple things that you can point to, and it depends on the person that you're trying to convince. Some people are numbers people, some people can be driven by passion, some people a mixture of both. I think one thing, and you know, talk to your wholesaler, or talk to your wholesalers that have a large number of craft brands. Ask them to talk to people about the way that craft is trending in the industry and how we're seeing increased sales and increased volume of these beers moving. I mean, you can come at it from a perspective of this will boost sales, or we don't want to get left behind if more people continue going this way and we kind of stay just doing the same old thing. That's effective for some people. For other people, though, I think if you can convince them that it is a good thing or get them hooked on any beers that fall into that category, that makes the sell a lot easier. So like I said, if you've got somebody who's primarily an American lager drinker, have them try a few, like dig up a few Kolsch's for them and have them taste those. Or do like lay out 5 beers for them blind and have them taste those and be like, okay, which of these did you like the best? And assuming that they picked something that falls into the group of beers that you wanted to push for them, then that could be a useful exercise in terms of working with them and saying, look, when you tasted these blinds, you said that this beer from this brewery was better than these other ones. Why aren't we selling that? So I don't know. It certainly can be difficult if you're getting a lot of pushback, but those are hopefully a couple things that you could potentially do.
That's great. And yeah, one question just came in. We touched on it a bit before, but how often do you recommend changing your list? I guess maybe on the far end, what would be like a minimum frequency of changing beers?
It kind of depends. I hate to keep saying it, but like it depends kind of on what your clientele is looking for. In some cases, I look at it the same way that I look at a lot of restaurants. It's at least nice to see a little bit of change seasonally, so that if somebody is coming in once every couple months and they're looking for something new, they're able to find that because you have made some slight changes to your list. Honestly, though, I feel like most bars tend towards one or the other. Bars either go for having a pretty static lineup or for having a pretty fluid lineup. And if your clientele is primarily satisfied with you keeping the same 8 beers on your draft list all the time, then maybe you don't need to be changing out beers very often. If you have a curated list that's working for you, there's no reason to be concerned with, well, every 6 weeks I need to make sure that I swap at least one of my beers out. In general, I would say my best idea on it is, try to keep at least half of your list static and half of your list changing if you're still trying to dial things in. And if you find that it works for you to have more rotating, or if it turns out that it works for you to have more static, follow the dollar. Customers vote with their dollar, and pay attention to what they're doing.
And one more question just came in. Let's see. Are there any potential risks associated with sudden growth of sours and wild yeast brews on the brew side and the bar side?
On the brew side and the bar side, so like getting a possible infection or something from sour, funky beers? A couple things there. So in general, when you're talking about flavor carryover, things that are higher in acid content are things that tend to impart residual flavor to the lines. So that's sour beer, but that's also ciders. If you have any alcoholic sodas, if you're doing any draft cocktails, all of those things tend to be higher in acidity than most beer is, and so tend to give some amount of flavor carryover. So generally, if you are a bar that's going to be putting on some sort of sour or wild beer, I recommend that you try to keep a line. Be mindful about how you're planning out your lines. Like line number 7 just had this Brett beer on it. We've got another Brett beer on. Don't be like, oh well, keg 4 just kicked, so we're just going to swap it in there. Make that be a dedicated line for that style of beer. It'll help you target a good blend of flavor profiles, and it'll also make sure that you aren't getting unnecessary flavor carryover across multiple lines. In terms of infection, especially in U.S. kegs, a lot of U.S. craft beer is not pasteurized, and so in beers that had action of some of those microbes, yes, you may see increased load of those in the beer, so you may get more of those in the line. But assuming, once again, that you are cleaning on a regular basis or cleaning every 14 days according to the draft quality manual guidelines, that should be enough to make sure that you don't end up with cleanliness or quality issues from that sort of situation.
And one other question, for beers that tend to change, do you think it's important to label them with a specific beer name? I'm assuming on a print menu type of thing, or should you just write seasonal?
I think the more information that you can give the customer, the better. If you have a list that is changing all the time, you might want to adopt a chalkboard sort of menu or something like that that's a little bit easier to, or you know, some sort of digital or electronic sort of menu that's easy to update on the fly. But in general, I know, you know, it's good to equip servers with as much knowledge as possible. But there are some people that are going to look at a list, and if they're looking at a print list and there's like 6 beers and one of them is just like seasonal, they're not even going to, that's not going to pique their interest. They might be like, well, I don't really want that. They may, or comes over to them. So I think in general, if you can give people more information up front, that's a better scenario.
And I know we're getting close to the end of the time, but it looks like one other question. What do you think about beer cocktails and the alcoholic soda movement?
So I will say on the alcoholic soda movement, I'm going to try to be as diplomatic as possible. I'm not personally a huge fan of it. I know that it is definitely something that is popular with certain segments of consumers. And so while it is certainly not my thing, I would say once again, you know, listen to your consumers, listen to what they want. If you're going to put some sort of alcoholic soda on and it's selling really well, then sell it. I mean, there's unless you have like firm principles against it, there's no reason not to do it. Important to remember with those alcoholic sodas, like I said, like with ciders, like with sour beers or smoky beers, a lot of times those are going to leave flavor behind in draft lines. So it's not usually a thing you could do to like put on an alcoholic root beer and then switch back to another beer without having to change out your jumper line. So that's something worth considering. But yeah, those are my thoughts on alcoholic soda. On beer cocktails, I think beer cocktails are awesome. Personally, you see a lot of times for people that work in the industry, you end up drinking a lot of beer for your job. And so sometimes when you're out to drink, you want to drink other things. And so I enjoy cocktails a lot as well. And you're seeing the same sort of craft thing happening in the spirits world and the cocktail world that you're seeing happen in beer, where people are looking at exploring a lot of different flavors and ingredients and flavor combinations. And with sort of the host of possibilities that beer can provide, I think it makes sense that some mixologists today are looking at beer and saying, hey, that's another cool flavor profile or thing that I can add to my bag of tricks. I actually just did like a little event series with a whiskey brand, where they asked me to work with their brand ambassador to come up with some beer cocktails. We had a lot of fun. I mean, you know, you're like, there are definitely some people that would look at that and say, well, you're adulterating the beer. The beer's meant to be drank on its own. To some extent, I think, you know, beer is supposed to be fun, and if you take it too seriously, it no longer becomes fun. So people that are excited about making beer cocktails and are doing cool things with it, more power to them. I think that's awesome. That's my take.
Great. Well, yeah, I'm trying to think. I think that's all the questions. A couple of people asked a bit about how to get involved or how to prepare for the Cicerone exam, and we did cover that quite a bit first webinar, so I can send you guys a link to that recording so you can learn a bit more. For me, when I prepared for the exam, I actually took a class with Pat on off flavors, and I would highly recommend that. That was tremendous and really helpful. So if you get a chance, and if you're able to, I'd definitely sign up for one of the classes with them to prepare for the tasting part of the exam. But thank you so much, Pat. It's a wealth of information, and definitely recommend getting involved with the Cicerone program to dive a bit deeper into all these topics. But yeah, thanks so much, Pat.
No problem. It's awesome. Fun to be on.
All right. Well, take care, guys. Thanks for tuning in.